Hello, hello. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. This is the third instance of the State Off. Today, we're talking about tech conferences, and I could not imagine a better person to speak to other than Sebastien. Please meet Sebastien, who is the Chief Community Officer at Uniborn, and he's also doing some consulting work. So we will talk about it in a little bit. Let me do a couple of announcements. First and foremost, we have open applications for a number of accelerator batches. So one of them is FinTech. Please check out the webpage, see if you're eligible to apply, and check if you can get investment from us. Same goes to SaaS Africa. We're looking for different businesses that are running in the vertical. And we're also looking for cybersecurity startups for our Italian batch, so go check it out. Other than that, there is one interesting program for vanapreneurs, or people who are looking towards creating their own businesses, matchmaking with the future co-founders, and bulletproofing their ideas. We have the Founders Club. You can find it on our website, and the application's deadline is April 26th. Now, with all the announcements done, Sebastien, thank you so much for joining, and hello.
Hi, thanks for having me.
All right. Before I go into the questions that I have for you, I would like to ask our audience to start populating their own comments on the stream. We will be highlighting interesting comments, and I will make Sebastien answer them. Maybe I will chip in on one or two. Let's see. And Sebastien, could you tell us a little bit about your background and how are you connected, or what do you think about technological conferences, given all your experience going to those?
Yeah, of course, more than happy to. So I kind of started my career in the tech sector in the Netherlands, where I was working for a company called the Next Web. Some of you might know it, some others not, but it's a large technology conference that happens every year in Amsterdam. Has been going on for like 16 years, but I joined the company in 2016. And I was basically in charge of startups for their events. So bringing founders to the conference to connect with investors, mentors, with corporates, to be able to basically equip them with as many connections as they can in a very short period of time. When I started back in 2016, I think our conference was around already 6,000-7,000 people, which was quite sizable, but we were basically bringing 50 to 60 founders from the Benelux. And then that grew as the whole industry has been evolving and expanding at a crazy pace. And by 2020, we were basically at 650 companies coming to the event, having about 2,000 meetings per couple of days of the conference, right? So organizing that and coordinating that is something that I spend a lot of time doing. And I think partially for market research and then partially to be helping the industry in other conferences, I've been traveling around. So I think over the 5 years that I was at the Next Web, I went to well over 100 conferences, but 65 major events in 28 countries. So got to see kind of the breadth of what's happening out there, from very small local events to major large conferences, and kind of see how different people do different things and how different ecosystems evolve at different pace. And it's very interesting to see from very niche specific targeted events around very specific industries to major generalistic conferences that bring everything and anything kind of under one roof and bring a lot of the tech world in one city for a few days. It's very different approaches. And I think some are better for certain startups than for others, and also at different stages of development. So I think there's a lot to be said for different types of events.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So, dear audience, you can ask questions both to an expert that has been to over 100 different types of events all around the globe, or to somebody who has been organizing the startup delegations as well. So please take the time and effort and shoot your messages. We will see them and obviously talk about those. Now, I think that, let's say, the topic that I would like to start with is going to be on the higher level. So why would a startup, do you think, want to go to a conference, and what do you think should be the overall strategy? Like, how do you choose a conference? How do you even approach the conferences?
Yeah, so actually, I think this is a really good point that you're mentioning. A lot of people don't tend to pay attention to that question. Is like, why would we go in the first place, right? It can seem like sexy or attractive. A lot of people are going to this event. We should be going as well. But I think you should have some very specific goals in mind when going to the events, and need to make sure that for your company, it's ROI positive, right? So especially in the early days of a startup, every dollar counts. Every amount of money that you're going to spend on anything, whether it's a $20 subscription for a tool versus doing the work manually yourself, or like hiring another employee or another intern to join the company, is being counted. Being at an event is the case. Like, it has costs involved, whether it's traveling there. If it's in the same country, is cheaper, but if it's abroad, then obviously flights involved or trains involved. Accommodation is something to be counted as well. And then the time that you're actually spending on the event away from your desk or working on your day-to-day work also has to be accounted for, which is something that's often left out of the equation. It's like, oh, conference ticket is only 100 euros or 200 euros. It's fine, I can just afford. Like, the overall package of you being away for 3 days or having your mind that actually not working on your day-to-day business is to be accounted for. So generally, most companies that I know would go abroad for two things. Either it's exposure, because they're in a phase of the development of the company which is generally not so early stage, where they have a product running or they have a service that's available for people to start to see, and they want to get the word out. So they go there to meet more people and to kind of showcase what they're actually building and releasing. And then the second one, which is probably the most important, or if you think on the ROI side, is like partnerships, right? If you're doing B2B sales, or if you're like looking to attract investment at a specific moment in your company's development, then you go there for that specific purpose. And then you work out, how much money do I need to make for this to be ROI positive? Meaning, I need to sign X amount of clients. So I need to be able to do X amount of intros and X amount of meetings to be able to lead down a funnel to the amount of sales that you want to make. So I think you need to be relatively strategic in how you're approaching the event and thinking, when does me being there start to make sense for the company? And depending on what the goal objective is at that different moment in time, what are the KPIs that I need to hit being present at that conference to make my attendance worth going? And sometimes it might be that the answer is just for fun, because you need to get your head out of whatever you're doing on your day-to-day and you just want to have fun. And I think that's fine. You don't need to feel bad about that, but you need to be aware up front of why you're going. And if it's sometimes just to have fun and you figure out that the cost investment is not that high, then you can justify it. But a lot of startups end up being, in my view, at events at the wrong time or for the wrong reasons, and then it's generally not so ROI positive. So understand why you're going and what that ROI looks like is very important. And to answer your primary question at the beginning of this, is like, when is the right time, is generally not at really, really early stage. When you're still trying to figure out, the MVP and building the base of your product, a lot of that research and that work is desk research, is done talking to the customers online, and is rarely at events or conferences where your main target audience is rarely going to be there. Unless you're building something that's highly specific, and the conference we're talking about is highly specific for that industry. But otherwise, you need to wait until you're a little bit further on your journey to be present at event for it to be really ROI positive.
Thank you so much. I'm remembering my very first solo travel to the conference abroad, which was the Web Summit back in 2015. So the last time it was in Dublin. And my manager at that time simply told me something like, oh, you have to bring 250,000 euros back. Otherwise, it's not a successful trip. And that was such a random number. Like, I asked him years after that, he was like, I don't know, I just wanted to give you a feel that it's important and you have to bring business from there. So probably when you're doing the planning, also don't do it just randomly out of thin air. You actually need to understand what are your objectives and what's this next strategic thing you need to reach by going to the conference. Sometimes if it's customer interviews, maybe sending one person who will be doing those interviews is fine. But if you have bigger strategic objectives, don't get deceived by, for example, startup delegations, which might seem that, it's a free trip, somebody is covering, I don't know, my governmental agency is covering our trip, but then you end up coming and kind of expecting that everything will be organized. That's not how it works. Even if you get a ticket or invitation, you still have so much work to do, and it's at least 2 weeks, if not more, prior to event, and then really quite some hours after that if you were successful in meeting those people. Thank you. I will be sometimes maybe chipping in just a couple of points. All right. So looking at the conferences, what I would like to cover, what are generally the types of conferences and how would you categorize them? Let me give you an example. So some conferences are really good to actually go into an ecosystem and do a deep dive in, I don't know, for example, South Summit in Spain is a very good way to understand what's the temperature in the Spanish startup ecosystem and generally corporate and investment world. So I would say that one of them could be this local introduction. What others do you categorize, and do you have maybe your own type of methodology figuring out what is this conference like?
Yeah, so I would definitely agree that they're not all created equals. I think every event are very different, and you kind of tend to go for different things depending on how the events are structured, right? So I think you mentioned some that are more like local focused, where a lot of the stakeholders that you will find on stage or that will be sponsoring the event are generally from that same country. South Summit is a good example because even though it has some international speakers, it's still heavily Spanish focused when it comes to the organizers and the speakers. A little bit less on the startups, which is starting to, also become more international, but at least half the companies there would be from Spain. You have some other types of events that are kind of more international by nature and very generalistic. So they're like kind of aiming for volume when it comes to the type of people they're attracting for different reasons. I would put like Web Summit and Slush in that category. So Web Summit, aiming at almost like 70,000 people in Lisbon, trying to attract a lot of the tech world to Portugal for those few days and bring everyone in the same city. I would say Slush is kind of doing the same for the Nordics and has been actually quite successful for a small place to attract a lot of international people and international investors as well. And then I think you have a lot more like focus or specific events like Hello Tomorrow, for example, happening, in France, in Paris, like would be focused on deep tech. You would have like the Mexico, which was in Germany, that's going to be more focused on sort of marketing in B2B companies. So it's ideal if you want to struck B2B types partnerships for certain companies. And then you would have some more that would be like even more specialist in like Money 2020 in Amsterdam will be very fintech driven. And they actually have chapters in other cities as well. So I think it's good to differentiate between regional and international events, and then between generalistic and industry specific or industry focused events. And then depending on what you're looking for, you're going to go more to like certain types of events. If you're a B2B SaaS startups, which I know is one of the main focus of like Wise Guys or has been for many years, it's generally fine to go to generalistic events because a lot of people and a lot of investors are interested in B2B SaaS. If you're working on something that's going to be more around biotech or hardware or quantum computing, or you're in some very like niche of like medtech related companies, going to specific events or in conferences that will be highly specific to your industry, even though they might not be so startup focused, but just industry focused, might be bringing a higher ROI to your company. So I think it depends a little bit on what type of startup you're building and what industry you're in. And in that sense, I would say that things that are generally software or B2B related have a broader scope of events that might be interesting for them, versus other categories of startups will have to target more niche types of events where the ROI will be maybe a bit harder to find. But once you're in the right place, very concentrated, which is nice. Because when we were talking about those generalistic events, everyone is there. But when you have, 20, 30,000 people walking around, actually being able to figure out which ones are relevant for you and how to get a meeting with those people, that's not easy. And that's where the work comes in, right? You talked earlier about how much work it can be going to conferences. The preparation involved to understand who are the individuals that you would like to meet and how you can make sure to get in touch with those people or cross path with them does take work. Absolutely.
Absolutely. I often get the question, so shall I go to the conference that is 300 people or like 50,000, and it's just such different beasts of its own, right? Okay, maybe one more point I wanted to add to what you have been raising. I think about the categorization or how you select the conferences you need to go to. You can also look at the proportions of different types of business representatives present there, because there are some conferences that are very startup heavy, and actually 80% of the attendees will be founders or somebody who works for a startup, while some conferences will be very heavily corporate or investor driven. And I think it's also very important to analyze those things and kind of align it with your bigger strategy. So what are the things you're looking for right now in order to boost your business in the next 6 months? And on this, we actually have a comment I would like to bring up. So Zana, thank you so much for watching and asking. I'm always puzzled how much preparatory work to do before the event. So scheduling meetings, researching speakers lineup, and how much to go with the flow and serendipity. What is your approach, Mariia and Sebastien? Sebastien, you go first.
Sure. There is a lot to be done, and I think there is a lot of prep work needed in order to get the ROI that you want. That said, I would say over the years my strategy has changed slightly. I think the first couple of times that I went, I kind of listened to a few former colleagues of mine and people in the industry that were telling me how to prepare. And first couple of conferences I was relatively unprepared. You kind of freak out to see the amount of information that you're bombarded with when you get to the events. And then the subsequent ones I started to prepare like very heavily, have like, meetings from morning to evening with a pretty tight schedule, just leaving time in the evenings for the networking, because I was already warned that that's important to do. And I think it has been proven really good in getting a lot of meetings, but it has also prevented me from being introduced to people, having a lot of serendipitous meetings, because it's like, oh, this sounds like it would be really interesting to talk to, but I have to run because I have another meeting that's already scheduled. So I kind of felt like over planning or having a completely packed schedule for generally 2 days or 3 days of the event was too much. So I kind of cut back from there. So what I'm doing is at the moment, spending a lot of time in the prep ahead of time to figure out who's going to be there, either using the website or the matchmaking platforms that a lot of conferences are proposing. So I go there up front, scan the list of attendees, see whether there's people that I can right off the bat think that will be an interesting meeting for me. Kind of plan 2-3 hours of meetings per day with some of those individuals. And then for the rest, leave it free for me to be able to have spontaneous meetings or introductions that would come from me being at the conference itself. And then generally tend to not prep any meeting from 4 p.m. onwards. That's kind of like cutoff for me. And from 4, I leave time for all the networking events. Because let's be honest, for those who haven't been that might be listening to this, a lot of the value that I've gotten from conferences has been happening from networking. And that doesn't mean per se getting drunk at every conferences that you go to, even though that might happen. But I think it's more like leaving time for those moments where people kind of leave their business cards or their titles at home and kind of you talk to people as individuals. I think some of the best conversations I've had at conferences were when I didn't know which company the people were from or what role they have. And you only find out later on when you connect at the end of the conversation or the following week when you catch up with them. But at the time, you're just having a conversation human to human, right? Because ultimately, that's what it is. The best connections you build are between individuals, not between companies or titles. So I would kind of plan effectively for a handful of hours of like packed meetings that might be back to back, but not take your entire day. Leave some room for a lot of like more spontaneous meetings or introductions that would be made, and then keep your evenings for networking and sort of more relaxed connections. That's how I'm doing them right now.
I think the networking was exactly how we met, and that kept happening for a couple more conferences, doing the after-hour networking events. That's how I got to know you. Well, my approach. Well, I'm all my life on the sales teams, so you can imagine I'm very heavily into preparation, scheduling, and going hardcore at the conferences. Like, I can easily have 20 meetings in one day when I'm in an active sales season. And Do I get tired? Yes, but it's actually an interesting challenge for me. I would say that there are basically 3 types of interactions you can plan for yourself for a conference, and it heavily depends on where is your business right now and which types of connections or which types of, I don't know, partnerships, whatever is the deal that you're looking for is going out of it. So the first one is the easiest, and it is catching up with the people you already know. I do go to some conferences to actually strengthen my relationships with the people that I already know, but that could be potentially interesting additions to my future commercial or, I don't know, startup goals, right? The second one could be this semi-serendipity type of thing when you actually know you will have people at the conferences and you go unprepared, but you use the people you know to get the introductions forward and to do more of this serendipitous networking. This works for smaller conferences. So if you're going to a conference or meetup that's like 50, 100 people, that's actually not so bad, because also that size of events don't usually have the networking capacity like an official app or something. And then last one is doing the thing, right? Going into the platform, studying all the participants, trying to schedule meetings and so on. You need to own your schedule. You need to know when and how you need help. I'm constantly working with my sales team actually when I'm going to the conferences, because it's a lot of work and a lot of communications. But I would say those are the 3 approaches you can take. And again, it really depends on why are you going to the conference, what do you want from it. And on the networking side, I'm shutting up after that. I think your only job when you meet a new person is to leave an impression, but there are 3 layers to it. So there is you as a personality. I have colored hair. I'm always joking that this is logistics at big events, because you just say I have purple hair, people find you. I don't know, I have a dog, I like to play PlayStation, so there's me as a personality, as a human being. Then the second layer is you as a professional. So I'm in business development for forever. I remember myself, I work with startups, I'm in augmented and virtual reality. So there is some professional layer to me. But again, this is just me as a person. And then you as a brand or as a company that you're representing. And your job is to leave associations for at least 2 of them, so that afterwards the person can remember you for some of the traits that you have been talking about. All right, thank you. I would like to ask you, as you have the experience of organizing the startup conferences, what would you say a startup should look for in organizers? So types of activities the conference is offering to the startup, and how to define a good organized startup, delegation or conference versus bad one?
Yeah, that's a difficult one, right? I think it depends a little bit on what the focus of the conference itself is. And to be honest, I'd say most conferences out there don't put startup first. Like, they're a part of the attendees that are coming to their event, but they're not a main focus for the organizers. And there's a few reasons for that, right? And the more you understand the logistics, the better. It's the same with understanding how VC funds work and how much a startup needs to return the VC fund in order to make the fund profitable, to decide whether that might be a good VC for them or not, or to decide whether VC is a good path for them to go down, period. So do the conference organizers actually cater to startups because that's a core audience for them? Or is it just nice to have them there, but they're not really bringing money, which is one of the reasons why most conferences don't focus on them. And they take a lot of time and resources to plan, because doing the one-on-one meetings or having areas for startups to be, every square meter of the conference is worth money. Building a whole matchmaking area for startups, that costs money. And generally, because they attract interesting type of individuals, conference wants to have founders there, but it's rarely a focus. So kind of understanding that on the delegation part is relevant. I would think that conferences like, I see some comments that were made earlier with MWC and 4 years from now in Spain, or with Vivatech in Paris, is interesting, because, as those events are two that have massive corporate sponsors, they can afford to take some of the money that's being allocated by those corporates to invite some startups for free and have them showcase somewhere, so they can offer them some space. In terms of how much is then going to be done in one-on-one matchmaking with relevant stakeholders, that's harder. The percentage of investors at MWC and at VivaTech compared to Slush is tiny. Those two conferences have way more people attending and less investors. So the ratio is much, much smaller. Slush, that only has 20,000 quote unquote people, 10,000, during COVID, would still have 2,000 investors, meaning that 1 out of 5 people walking around is going to be an investor looking to invest some money or to at least meet the founders. So for you to kind of figure out how many people are at the conference, what's the amount of founder and what's the amount of investor and what ratio you're at, is going to make it more or less worth your time. So that's something that I would look at. And then in terms of like the delegations, if you're talking about government sponsored ones, I would think about how much are they planning the tour offered to startups and what individuals are they going to present you to? Like, do they give you the freedom to meet whoever you want and plan your schedule and just arrange the logistics? In which case, as a founder, you have free reign to gather as much value as you can? Or are you, quote unquote, going to be dragged along a tour to meet some officials and to kind of tick boxes because the delegation has to meet a certain amount of individuals? In which case, you need to figure out, how much free time do I have, or how many relevant individuals would I meet? And is it worth my time to go for 2-3 days if the general tour is what I need to go through? And who are the individuals on that tour, right? I'll say one more thing about this, and then I think we can have a bit of a back and forth, because I'm curious to have your perspective. But it's not because it's an organized tour that it is per se bad. I have to say, I have joined a tour that was organized for journalists and people working in the tech space here in Estonia when I moved a year and a half ago. And we have met unicorn founders, we've met the main government representative in charge of innovation, and then the president and the prime minister, all in the same tour within the space of 2 days. I would have never had those meetings if it weren't for the organizers who put that together. So they did a fantastic job. So I'm not saying it's per se bad. I think you want to analyze, what is that tour like? Who are we going to meet? Are they transparent about who we're going to meet up front? And how much time do I have in between to be running my own schedule? And based on that, deciding whether it's a good fit for you or not. So that's kind of how I would look at it.
No, absolutely. I think I can just add that, remember that it's your time. And even if you're invited, you still need to critically analyze whether it's worth it. So what is going to be a return of your investment of time and money that you're dedicating to this? Because unfortunately, I see that, there is this, what do you call it, a stereotype that networking is not working. If you go to conferences, it's just you hanging around, going to after parties and so on. Actually, no, it's hard work, and that is your way to boost your personal and professional network really to unimaginable levels. So I think that some parts of the stigma about networking, because people have stereotypes that, you have to go outside of your comfort zone, you have to go and do the pick-up lines to the people you don't know. You don't need to do any of that if you're well prepared. And parts of the stigmas are just going to poorly organized delegations or conferences without your own personal agenda. And then obviously when you enter the room, there's a lot of strangers and you're just looking around feeling sad and bored and like if you were wasting your time. That's where the stereotype starts to build up and, bring the stigma on it.
Yeah, it's a good point. I guess there's a couple of things that we could talk about there as well, on sort of the preparation, right? Prior to going to event, figuring out who in your network is also going to those events. If it's industry specific, then some people from the industry who might not be living in the same city as you, but would end up going to the same event in that same location. And if it's people from home or other co-founders or founders that you would know from the same country, connecting with them beforehand has one really big advantage, in my opinion. Like, the idea is that you wouldn't be sticking around with that same person the whole conference, because I've seen that before, and then it defies the purpose, because you could be abroad but still not bring any new connections or any new value because you're only sticking with the people you already know. I would advise against that. It's for a good time, but it's not very ROI driven. However, those people might have connections that you don't have. And when it comes to getting invited to specific side events or to specific networking elements where a lot of value is being created, you might not have all of the entry passes to those, and other people that you know might. So I think being able to gather access to specific parts of the events that we know are ROI positive through other people is very helpful, especially if you have investors in your network or corporates that get invited to other types of networkings than founders generally would. That is a really good hack for founders. Something else to keep in mind is those exclusive events or some of the most interesting networking VIP events that are happening get booked out quite early on. A lot of one-on-ones at the conference you can still organize kind of when you get there, almost, if you haven't been able to prepare up front. But getting entrance to those events is harder. So I would say the planning ahead, a couple of weeks ahead, is a good, benchmark to work with. Much earlier, a lot of that stuff isn't released or isn't always easily public, but at least a couple of weeks before is good. And then try to get access to those things by talking to the right people in your network. It's things that are generally not public or not often even made public. Through events like this, you figure out that they exist, and then you figure out in your network who gets access to them and how you can get added on those guest lists. I think that's it's not mandatory. It's just going to enhance the experience, and I think enhance the ROI that you get from being there.
What do you think generally about the conferences that are far either abroad or from your niche? So what I'm trying to ask is, being in Europe and working with European startups, I see them sometimes trying to go to China for an event, to Singapore, to Canada, to Brazil. So, and to be honest with you, usually the feedback is not so effective. So while you're in your home market, even if it's as broad as the whole EU, which is a lot of countries in the year, it feels like going completely outside of your context, either culturally or maybe by the vertical and industry, is tough. So what would be your experience in this? Have you done such things? I'm sure you did. And how did you make it work?
Yeah, it's again, great question. I think it very much depends on the company and on their goals and objectives. I've been abroad to conferences actually in the US and in Asia, but not that often. Vast majority of events I've been to are Europe, and that was because that was my focus as a representative from the Next Web, and then later on just for working for other companies. Europe was my market, so most of the events I've been to were in Europe. When I was invited to the US or to Asia, generally I was either judging or speaking, representing the company, so asked to represent our business from Europe in Asia, and therefore they wanted us to be present there. But otherwise, if it was for business development purposes, I wouldn't have gone because that was just not relevant for me. So I would say, depending on where your potential customers are, our startup, if you're focusing on growing in Asia or growing in Canada, because that's been identified as a huge market opportunity for your company specifically, I would say, why not, right? I have had some companies that were working in the medtech space that would have picked like Switzerland or other markets that would have been non-obvious for SaaS startups, but it was for them because of the industry. But if it's not because it's a fun event or it's a large conference that you should go. If it's in a market that's not focused on what you're trying to develop, I would stay away from it. And the biggest, advice there is, don't go to the US unless you really have a reason to. I think a lot of people think, oh, let's go to San Francisco or let's go to New York because it's fun and there's a lot of great startups being built there. That's true. But if it's not relevant for your company, don't waste your time. It's very costly. It's far away. It takes a lot of resources for you to go there as a company. And the flip side of that would be a company like Verif, which some of you might know. It's a cybersecurity identity verification company here based in Estonia. They have expanded in the United States. I think almost half of their clients now are in the US, and it's a B2B SaaS model that is actively working in the United States. So they did go there. They brought a team there. Now they've opened an office, and it just made sense for them strategically to go to the United States because of their customer base. But if it isn't, I would stay away from it. Even if you're invited, just because you want to make sure it contributes to what you're trying to build as a business. So if you identify a real business opportunity, it makes sense. And maybe the last little example I would use there are a number of companies from Spain who have decided to go to South America to certain events because of the language. The South American market is very prone as a next expansion market for them to go and spend time on. And some of them have done that very successfully, or vice versa. Some South American companies that would come to Spain to try it out before entering the rest of the European market and using that as a nice language bridge for them to test their solution before seeing if that would work to the rest of Europe. Brilliant connection. But again, there's a strategic decision behind why that would work. So that's how I would approach it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I also agree that if it's on your business roadmap, maybe it's a good way to go and start your research. But generally, it has to be a very strong decision towards that market. Otherwise, you're just doing the roadshow and traveling. It's not really working on the conference. All right, thank you. I think we touched a little bit upon this question, but I would like to bring up a question from Lev. Would you recommend visiting tech conferences to students or idea stage startups, and what would be the pros and cons of going there from your point of view?
Yeah, so on the student side, I would say definitely. If you're like a student that's looking for, attractive ideas, meeting some people, I think it could be really good for you to be present at event. But it still doesn't take away the earlier ROI question that we've done. Students are generally quite poor, have limited resources, and then imagine even traveling abroad for some conferences is difficult. How do you justify it, right? Or who do you ask money for it? It's kind of difficult. So there's a few options. There are some very cheap student tickets for a lot of conferences out there. So if you're local and the event is happening in your city, by all means, go and get inspired. I think if not, I love personally the idea of volunteering to conferences and actually spending time working, meeting some of the organizers, being able to ask questions to the people who are putting the event together, get to see the behind the scene, the thing that most people attending conferences don't see because they're not organizing them, which I think there's a lot of value to be gained from. And then later on, you get access for free. So I think that's an amazing opportunity. Slush actually dedicated an entire program where I think 50 people can apply from all around the world and get it sponsored by the government to fly there and actually be present and help, etc., which has been amazing, I think, to be able to bring people from various backgrounds that might not be able to make it otherwise to have access to that opportunity. But I would definitely say on the volunteering side, it's great. I personally volunteered at the Next Web for 2 years before joining the company full time, where I then ended up working almost 5 years. And it was one of the best decisions I've made. I had volunteered at a couple of other smaller, more regional events before. And I think you just get a lot of knowledge for it. That's kind of how I felt I got my passion for the tech industry and the tech world, is by volunteering at those events. So I would say absolutely, to get inspired, yes. As an idea stage startups, less so, just because I think it's like, does that make sense for you at this level, right? If you're thinking idea stage, you want to build a product around certain area and you're doing very early customer discovery and you find a way to get access to the conference free of charge, right? Why not? It's always good to be able to just talk about the idea you have with some people kind of on a broad level, as much as the cost is not going to be very high. I think that's possible. But otherwise, if you know that you're going to be working for sure on that startup and you have an early team and you just need to, build, then don't waste your time. You probably have a better use of your time than being at the conference at that point. Until you have something that's ready to show to people and to actually gather that customer traction, you'll be able to have way more calls and more meetings by not being at the event and actually being at home. I have just talked to a startup in Baku 2 weeks ago who was able to reach 100 targeted relevant users via Twitter in the space of 2 days. That's something you're not going to do talking to random people on a conference. So I think it's about figuring out what is right at what time. As a student who's looking for inspiration to figure things out, to understand, what areas they might want to work for, what type of companies, it's great. When you're building your startup, you just need to build. That's kind of how I would see it.
Yep. Fully agree. Let's bring the question from Zana, our head of brand, and she has a very good question for almost an end of our conversation. So what's your approach to after conference follow-up and sustaining the new connections?
Yeah, it's a very tough one. I think it's probably the hardest part is the post-conference follow-up for a few reasons. And in all honesty, I was very bad at it at the beginning. I think it took me a very long time to get better at it. And I still don't think I'm great at it. I know some people in my network who are amazing at doing the follow-ups. It's simple. You have to have a systematized system. Like it has to be very clear in your head how you go about it. Some people collect business cards. Some people add LinkedIn connections and then go back through those connections. Other people are preparing, that's one of my favorites, a nice email template that you keep in your draft. And when you're done with the conversation with someone, you ask them to pop their email in your phone and send them the email straight away, right there and then, or keep it in draft and send it when you go home at the end of that day, sometimes on the same conference day or at the end of the conference. And then later on the following week, you can go up with a more elaborate follow-up or propose a next meeting or something like that. A lot of people would then focus on spending time to put people in their CRM. If you're in sales like Mariia, you would go into whatever CRM you use and then start putting the deals, put a little note around the conversation that you would have had. One thing that I would suggest is as you're making that note in your draft on the email or in a notepad, like I had a friend, he basically had a note on his phone and he would just put the name of the people and then one line as to what it is that they discussed or what's kind of the last thing that they closed the conversation on. And that you kind of have to do almost on the spot, because at the end of the day, after 20 conversations, you don't remember what's been happening. So kind of post conversation, take 30 seconds, just write down what it is that you spoke about with that person and what you should do for your follow-up. But it is something you need to allocate time for. And most of the teams that I've worked with, not just at the Next Web, but across several organizations, would not allocate the necessary time after the conference to do that. Like, let's imagine you go to a conference on Wednesday, it ends on Friday night. You either take a late flight Friday night or then back on Saturday. Some people spend the weekend because they want to chill in whatever city they're in and then come back Sunday night. And Monday morning, you're back at work with a full schedule and the backlog of what you didn't do the week before, because generally that keeps piling up as well. So unless you're able to block in your calendar at least a couple days to be able to take care of that backlog and to do all your follow-ups, you're losing a lot of value of being present at the conference. And I think that's kind of the issue is you do generate a lot of enthusiasm and meetings with some people, but if you don't do your follow-ups correctly, that kind of goes down the drain. And then it's, effort that you've put in to generate some responses that then will never, get the appropriate response because you don't get to do your follow-ups properly. So later on or after this call, we could always give pointers as to what are all the things you can do for those follow-ups. I've given a few, tips, but there's more things that you can do. But the most important part is do allocate time for it. Because if you're not allocating time for it, you're essentially wasting some precious resources.
Yeah, I will just chip in with a couple of points. I think the first and the biggest, if you promised something, you have to deliver. Just letting the conversations open-ended and then getting back to it months after the conference because now you finally have time to spend on your follow-ups is not an option. And for the most important conversations, I do send an email the same evening or day. I found a life hack. So, on some chat messengers, you have the chat with yourself. I actually, after the meeting, just hit the audio recording and I talk through the main points that I think are important about this person and this meeting. And I try to give it context. So not only send a follow-up with this presentation, but actually, what did we discuss? What was the content? Sometimes I put something like they seemed interesting, or I don't think they're going to have the budget for this, something, well, if you're in sales, you know what I mean. But leaving those audio notes will help you remember the full context. Because again, if you're doing 20 meetings during the conference or more, it will just all be blur next week. I promise you. You will not remember what you've been talking to different people about. And it is important to deliver upon that. Okay, and now I would like to close off with a question from me that I think could be relevant for our audience. And this is to you again, as once being a part of the organizers team. So when you have been preparing the startup areas, and if you have been a part of the pitch competitions or any sort of more public presence of the startups, what were you looking for in the startups? So how can we help our audience to be more noticeable and somehow get the attention from the organizers to actually be invited to some more unique opportunities?
Yeah, so the main thing is like, how much value does your solution bring? Like, how much is the audience going to care? Like, is it something that the people attending the conference are going to value? If you're going to a very deep tech focused event, then you won't want a generalist type of startup like to be on stage, right? I think that's one thing. And then the second thing would be how different it is than the rest of the solutions that are present on the market. That's something that I was always very much struggling with when we were looking at the pitch competition. Sometimes we had some very talented startups that were building business models that I think could generally be successful and make money. But there were so many of the same solutions out there on the market that is just not exciting for our audience. When we would come up with someone who had a very different business model than most other companies out there, who would have a very interesting founder or person pitching and representing the company. You have to think we're all humans, right? I think ultimately, and I can say it because I'm the target audience, but if you have a 45-year-old white guy who's not very interesting, who's going to be speaking on stage versus a bubbly and talented young woman who's going to be there and talking about something different, it kind of breaks up a little bit, the way that the stage time feels. Some people might say it's sexist, and I think part of it is true, but the reality is it's always guys and generally middle-aged white men who are on stage, and that's just not great for a program. We want more diversity. I think more investors want and more organizers want to put a conference program that is diverse, that is representing society as a whole. And the majority of the tech world isn't very diverse, but it is our role to show the example and to be a lead in terms of being able to bring different people. So on terms of the startups, differentiate yourself, show to the organizers and to the people listening to you why you're different and what you're doing is genuinely, setting yourself apart from the rest of the crowd. And then in terms of the speaker themselves, I think there's no much hack I can give. It's just the reality of the market, that if you are, looking like I am right now, your chances of having stage time at major conferences is just going to be low, unless you're building a unicorn and you already have the track record and the traction necessary. But if you're a very early stage startups, it's just hard. I think there's no way around that.
So storytelling and knowing how you differ from the market is your key to becoming more visible at the conferences and getting to some invite-only places.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Sebastien, thank you so much. We're a little bit even over time, but thank you. This was an interesting conversation for me personally. I'm hoping that our audience also found some practical things they could be implementing right away. Thank you so much for your time. And dear audience, we will be doing the next state of type of event on May 10. And this is going to be the state of startup PR. So Zana will be leading that one. Make sure you tune in. Sebastien, thank you.
Thanks for having me. It's been great to be here.